In this lesson, we're going to learn how to prepare our images to be imported into 3ds Max for reference images. Okay, so you may have a character that you've drawn up or you've sketched up in Photoshop or on paper, and you're ready now to go ahead and bring it into 3ds Max. And there's always a couple of things that you should always check before you actually bring in any reference images to begin modeling. Simply because you want to check things like proportions, and you want to just make your images as easy as possible, especially if you're creating reference images for someone else in the pipeline. So a couple of things that I always like to check first is my proportions in my images. So normally what I'll like to do is I'll go ahead and I'll bring in both of my images into the same document here, and I'll just put them on different layers. And what I like to do is just kind of trick myself a little bit. Normally whenever I look at images and I look at them side by side, sometimes my eyeball, if I'm trying to eyeball it, it kind of tricks me sometimes. So what I like to do is go ahead and actually just bring up one image at a time and bring up some guidelines. So let's go ahead and bring up our rulers, and we can do that with Control R. And we can actually click and drag on these rulers and bring down guidelines. So normally what I'll do is start bringing in guidelines on areas that are my major points. So the first major points that I always check are the top of my head and the bottom of my feet. So let me go ahead and zoom out just a little bit so I can see both of those. And I'll just click and drag one more time to bring in another guideline. Now normally I won't go down to like the end of the foot like this, normally because it's sticking out at us in the image, and it tends to be drawn downward in this direction. So what I like to do is just go right to where the heel seems to be touching the ground. Okay, so I'll bring in these two guidelines, and then I'll go ahead and do some major points. I'll do the tops of the shoulders. Sometimes I'll do like the bottom of the shoulders where the actual chest and the armpit meet. And sometimes I'll come in and I'll do like the waistline. And then the knees. Okay. Now these are most of the major points that you would want to check. If your character's proportions are not meeting these simple criterias, you're going to have some issues. So what I'll do now is go ahead and come in and go to my profile and bring that in and just check to see if this matches. So the bottom of my feet are pretty close. My knees seem to be a little off. We might check those. Our waistline seems good. We have the bottom of our armpit, the top of our shoulder, and then the top of our head. And then this actual little claw piece is matching up as well. So the only concern that I might have is my actual knee here. So some things that you can do to actually check this out and make sure that the image itself is okay, what we can do is actually grab our profile image, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit Control I, and I'm just going to invert its colors. Okay. Now what I'll do is go ahead and change this over to an overlay, and you'll see that we can't see that any longer. You can see a little bit of white in here. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and select my front view and add a new layer. And I'm not even really going to name this anything. I'm just using this to bring in just kind of like a gray hue. So I'll just grab a different color, grab something like a light gray, and I'll just go ahead and paint that in there. Okay. So now that that's in there, let's go ahead and take its opacity down. And we can see that our background image, our front image, and our profile. So that's just a way of doing it. You could do it a bunch of other different ways if you want to, but this is just one way that I prefer. Okay. So what I'll do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and grab my profile layer, and I'm going to hold down Shift and actually drag this off to the left. And I'm actually just checking my knees. And what I had done is I put this guideline right at the top of the knee. So that's why it looked like at the top of the knee. So we can definitely tell with this that this is correct. Okay. So one thing to remember about reference images is we always want to check our proportions to the actual sketch itself. Now the next thing that we want to check is to make sure that the actual image is proportioned inside of the actual physical size of the image itself. So let's hit Control Z one time, And I'm going to go ahead and do Control I again, just to take that back to what it was before. And let's go ahead and change it back to its normal there. And we can actually get rid of this layer 1. Let's get rid of it there. There we go. So let's go ahead and just hide our profile image. And what I want to check now, let's go ahead and clear our guides. I want to check the proportions of this actual image, especially the front view. So I'm going to go to View and Clear Guides for right now. And I'm actually going to go ahead and actually bring in a guide and center this up on my image. Now, I know where the center is at because I can actually see the size of my image. So if the left side is at 0 and my right side is about 17 3/4, I need to come in here and go to just in between 8 3/4 and 9. Okay, that's exactly halfway. So that's going to be the center point of my actual image. So this is looking pretty good. Now, if your front image, if the center is a little off, okay, you might want to resize that image. You might want to crop it down and then make sure that you're centered up right on your character here. Okay. Now, you could fix it in 3ds Max. You could do that very simply, but normally whenever we are creating references images like this, we don't want to spend a whole lot of time with references images while we're in 3ds Max, especially if you hand it off to another modeler. Okay, they just want to get in and start modeling and do what they're supposed to be doing, and instead they have to go ahead and they have to fix the reference image because it's not centered or it's not proportioned correctly, and you may even get your reference images kicked back to you to fix them. And whenever you have to go back and redo something, that's losing a lot of time. So we want to save time by making sure that everything is nice and neat before we hand it off to someone else. Okay? Now, the last thing that I like to do with my reference images is I like to actually tone down the colors here. A lot of people like to go ahead and actually just use this white background with their black lines, and that's totally fine. If that's something that you like to do, go for it. But for me, as a modeler, I don't really like to sit and stare at a reference image like this, because then after a while it begins to hurt my eyes, and I'll spend several hours on a specific model. So what I like to do is actually kind of tone down the contrast. So what I'll do is I'll come in above my profile here, and I'll create a layer, and I'll actually just go ahead and create kind of like a dark gray color over the top of this, and I'll just fill this layer with that. Okay, and what I like to do with this layer is just go ahead and take the opacity down, and I can actually dial in something that's a little bit more comfortable for my eyes. So if I think it's too dark, I can always lighten it up. Okay, so that way I don't have to sit there and choose colors and try to mess with transparencies and things like that. So this is just one way that I like to do it. So normally I'll find a place with a gray. If it's a darker gray like this, I'll find a place around 65 to 70. And I like to usually stay in an area like this. Now you might be wondering, okay, well the lines are a little harder to see. Okay, well whenever you're modeling, you're working in pretty close, but you're really going to appreciate a darker color like this, especially whenever you start working with your wireframe. And in most 3D packages, wireframe tends to be white whenever it's selected and you're working on it. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at what wireframe could look like without this turned on. So I actually have some wireframe up in this area right here, and let's go ahead and just bring that in. And you'll notice that you can't hardly see that at all. You notice a little bit of change whenever I brought that in, and that's because it's covering up some of my actual image, but you can't see the actual wireframe on the inside. So if we go ahead and make this gray, we can see that wireframe a lot easier. Okay? So this is another reason that we want to go ahead and actually make our reference images kind of like a gray color. Okay? Just make them a little bit darker than that actual white. Okay? So now that we've actually talked about going through how we can prepare our reference images, let's get right into 3ds Max and start talking about a couple of different ways that we can bring in those reference images. So I'll see you in the next lesson.